Rufus, thank you very much indeed for coming along. I've got a 20-minute slot, so I'll speak, if it's OK with all of you, for about 12 minutes, and then we can have 8 minutes for questions about the great whirling drama of British politics, which remains as compelling as ever. I thought I'd talk briefly about the drama of the EU referendum. I do a live one-man show, so you can see the full version at another date. It is a fantastically rich Shakespearean drama being played out in front of our eyes. One of the key fascinations with it is this. Most of the time in British politics, a spell is cast over us, and that spell is this, that all cabinet ministers agree with each other 24 hours a day. When you think about it, it is ridiculous and preposterous, but that is the way British politics is conducted. Of course they don't. A lot of them hate each other and have great ideological disagreements around the clock. But in public, there is a pretense of total agreement. That spell has now been broken. David Cameron has done it, not because he wanted to and suddenly has discovered an appetite for free speech. He has done it because he had no choice but to do it. 6 members of his cabinet might well have resigned if he hadn't done it. And so, in front of our eyes now, we are about to experiencing something new to us, or relatively new. And that is people within the tent arguing with each other in public. Now, there is a view that this will have very little difference in the great scheme of things, that after the referendum is over, they'll all get back together again, and we will once again be part of this magical spell in which everything anyone says in cabinet is echoed by all the others. It won't work like that. And we have a clue as to what will happen. And that clue lies in the past. There was a referendum in 1975. Looking around this room and on the stage, we're all far too young to have been part of that referendum. But I have looked at it, and it is really interesting. Exactly the same sequence happened then. The Labour Party was split over Europe, as the Tories have been for the last 20 or 30 years. The then Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, called a referendum, not because he wanted to, and by the way, Cameron desperately didn't want to have this referendum, but he had to do it to keep his party together. And Harold Wilson announced that cabinet ministers would be able to disagree with each other. He called it, Wilson, by the way, for those of you, I'm not cracking up, he had a silly voice, and Wilson announced that I have decided to give the cabinet an agreement to differ. They will be able to disagree with each other on this single issue during the referendum campaign, and then cabinet collective responsibility will be reinforced once more. Wilson, like Cameron, assumed that this would be a manageable process, that cabinet ministers would be very polite to each other and keep a fairly subdued profile during the campaign in order to protect their party. In 1975, the exact opposite happened. For example, Panorama, then a peak-time BBC One programme, staged a live discussion between 2 of Wilson's most senior cabinet ministers on opposite sides of the debate. On one side, Roy Jenkins, his Home Secretary, and on the other, Tony Benn, his Industry Secretary. You should watch it. It's on YouTube. It is fantastic theatre. And it goes something like this, and you can imagine Wilson watching at home with his wife, Mary. This will be a fairly docile debate, Mary. Let's have a look. Anyway, Roy Jenkins said to Tony Benn, well, with every respect, Tony, I can't take you seriously as an economics minister. You just don't understand economics. That was to his Industry Secretary in the same cabinet. And Ben said to Jenkins, with respect, Roy, you're not telling the truth about Europe. We're going to lose our sovereignty, and this is about parliamentary democracy, and you're not telling the voters the truth. He was accusing his own Home Secretary and his own cabinet of lying. And actually, although that Labour government got together again for a few more traumatic years, the breakup broke the spell. Ben and Jenkins were in different parties 5 years later. Now, I'm not saying exactly the same thing will happen this time. It will be different this time. But already you can see the tensions rising. Number 10 instructed the In campaign, with which it has been discreetly working for many, many months, not to attack the cabinet ministers coming for Out. They said, we've got to keep this on an even keel. Who on Monday broke that instruction? Last Monday, Cameron himself did. So worked up, he launched that attack on Boris in the House of Commons. Not that Boris is in the cabinet, but you know what I mean. A big figure. I was in the House of Commons watching Cameron's statement, looking down at Boris, and when Cameron did his thing about no one wants to go for a divorce in order to remarry and all that kind of stuff, I saw, well, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? And it was a moment of electric confrontation between two people who are supposed to be on the same side. This is in week 1 of the campaign. The other thing the referendum throws up, talking about Shakespearean themes, is the battle within politicians. We all have it as human beings, between loyalty. Loyalty to what? To your convictions, to your friends, to your wider cause, to ambition. Gove was in agony, Michael Gove. Excuse me. Michael Gove was in agony about what to do. His conviction told him he wanted to leave. Thank you, the water will be good. His convictions told him he wanted to leave the European Union. He didn't like it. He thinks it is undemocratic. But Gove knew that in making his decision to campaign for Out, he could bring about the destruction of his two closest friends in politics, Cameron and Osborne. What to do? What to do? Boris. What do I do? What do I do? We've had endless reports about he was playing tennis over the weekend as he made his decision. It was partly about ambition, but these people are human beings. Like all of us when we face complex decisions, it's not just about one thing. So it would be a caricature to say it was just about ambition. He has doubts about the European Union, but evidently he has doubts about Out too. If any of you read his article in the Daily Telegraph where he explained his decision, he didn't actually explain his decision for Out. He said we should vote out and then renegotiate and have another referendum, blah, blah, blah. You could see the anguish. Boris, the showman, the actor, could not hide for once his real feelings. So this referendum is going to produce great moments of significance, personal drama. Here I'll mention the importance of the newspapers, and then we'll open it out for questions. The newspapers have two important roles in this drama. One, only they have the space to explore what I've just been talking about briefly. I can't tell you how constrained, my background's in the BBC, I can't tell you how constrained the broadcasters are in this referendum campaign. Every time there's an eruption on the Out campaign, in the newspapers or on websites, you can explore in depth what's happening. The BBC would have to include an Out person, then an In person to balance what the Out person is saying, and then Laura Coombsbo will pop up with some piece de camera which doesn't offend the In or Out campaign because she has to be so careful about balance. In print, you have the space to explore words, and are less constrained in doing so. The other thing which is interesting to note is the continuing influence of newspapers. Cameron was really worried when he came back from Brussels with his negotiation deal at the onslaught he got from some of the newspapers. There is a strange dynamic that still goes on in which newspapers, to some extent, shape the way these supposedly mighty leaders think. And newspapers continue to have an influence on the BBC. If you go to the World at One, the World at One meeting begins at 7:30 in the morning at Radio in Broadcasting House. You can't see anyone because they're buried in newspapers. And the BBC often follow up what has been in the newspapers. There is a dynamic there too. So I think I better open it up to questions, actually. My timing says something slightly different to the watch here. I'll just say something else about Corbyn. That is the other great drama being played out in front of our eyes. The election of Jeremy Corbyn is the most extraordinary story that I have ever covered because it was so wholly unexpected. Although in retrospect, you can see so clearly it had an inevitability about it. Same way as Trump in the United States, Sanders to some extent in the United States, Greece and all the rest of it. There is such a sort of whirl of anti-politics out there. Candidates who appear to come from the outside command immediate attention and support. But here too is a great Shakespearean theme for Corbyn. Who is he loyal to? His convictions or his new responsibilities as a leader? And imagine the dilemmas he faces. Here he is, unexpectedly, securing the dream job he had never even dreamt about going for, let alone winning. And at that very point, he is in agonies. Do I back Europe when I don't really want to back Europe? Do I campaign for Europe last Saturday or agree to speak at the CND anti-Trident rally because that's where my convictions lie? But in following my convictions, I know I'm going to alienate this parliamentary party who hates me. Every day, agonizing dilemmas. And in a way, part of him must yearn for the purity of being that backbencher when he could cycle into work, vote against his leadership, and follow his convictions in an uncomplicated way. At the hour of his triumph, that landslide win last September, actually his dilemmas and complexities in politics began. That's a brief summary. Thank you for listening. And now we've got a few minutes for questions. So could the lights come up a bit? And who would like to ask something about Europe, Corbyn, the media, whatever? Yes. Could say who you are and be very quick because we're short of time.
Tony Regan from Trinity Mirror. Just on the in-out thing, we understand, I think, that the public is polarised 30-30-30 roughly in middle out. Which news brands do you think are best equipped to properly inform the middle, the floating voters in a sense in the middle, because lots of news brands are sort of already aligned with the position of in or out?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question on a couple of levels. First, I think some newspapers are in a degree of agony about this. I mean, my guess, and I'm only guessing, that the Times newspaper, reading its leaders, could well be heading for out, but I wonder whether that is in total alliance with its readership. And that applies to some of the others as well. In terms of targeting that middle 30% undecideds, it's a good question because all the newspapers are going to be quite one-sided on one level. I noticed the new one and the Eye are absolutely asserting their impartiality, which is probably quite a clever thing to do because it is so distinct in what is notoriously a kind of one-sided campaign either on one or the other. It looks as if most of the papers will be for out, which is a massive difference from 1975. Every single newspaper in 1975, except for the Morning Star, were for in. So it's going to be interesting to see the degree to which that makes a difference this time. I think it will make a difference because the media continues to mediate on all its different platforms. People aren't watching this round the clock. I bet not a single voter has read Cameron's negotiated deal with Donald Tusk. I haven't. Anyway, another question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Demi at PhD. What do you think the implications are for the Tory leadership, regardless of whether we vote in or out?
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. This is another layer to this drama, which incidentally I think print is much better suited to handle. One, if we vote out, Cameron will go. He will resign quickly. He has no choice but to do so in those circumstances. And so we could be in the middle, if this happens, of the most extraordinary political turbulence. A Tory leadership contest, a renegotiation to pull out of the European Union, and possibly Nicola Sturgeon popping up to say, we want to stay in the European Union, we want a second referendum on independence. If we vote to stay in, it partly depends on the manner of the victory, how big it is. We know that from Scotland, a 10% win does not necessarily mean a win at all. The losers have been triumphant ever since in Scotland. So if we win, it becomes more likely that Cameron stays on for a bit, but the clock will be ticking. We know from Blair when he said, look, I won't serve, I'll serve a full term, but not another term. Yeah, thank you very much. Power oozed from him from that moment. And Cameron mistakenly did the same thing. So I think the leadership contest will be hugely influenced by what happens on June the 23rd.
Can you see Boris actually ever becoming leader?
Well, there is a scenario where if he fights a brilliant campaign over the next couple of months, and that's quite a big if in my view, but if he fights a brilliant campaign and outwins, he will be the favourite to be the next Prime Minister. And it will happen quickly, because as I say, Cameron cannot, I can't see how Cameron renegotiates our exit, having said it's a make or break thing for our country to stay in. So yeah, there is a scenario, but it depends on him performing in a way that he has not performed so far in this campaign, in my view, because I think his opening gambits have been all over the place, frankly. If you read that Telegraph article, for example. But he's popular. He's more popular than George Osborne and Theresa May and all these other embryonic leadership candidates. Time for one more question, I think. Anyone from this side or? Yeah, thanks.
Nick Hewitt from The Guardian. Over the States, it's Super Tuesday. It's Trump versus someone, maybe. Give us your view.
Well, I mentioned Corbyn, and what's happening in the United States is part of this, isn't it? I mean, there is an extraordinary... It's a revolt against the insecurities of globalization in all its forms. And here come these charismatic individuals offering solutions without quite explaining how they're going to do it. Hasn't Trump suggested he's going to build a wall between the United States and Mexico? Well, I don't quite see how this wall is built, a kind of Berlin Wall. But it feeds these insecurities. In the same way, if you went to those Corbyn rallies in the summer, they were extraordinary. They were like sort of rock and roll events where there was this great sense of anticipation. And then this sort of curious 66-year-old figure walked on the stage and gave the speech he'd given for the last 20 years. But this time it resonated. And he was cheered as if he was David Bowie back on earth. And yet he wasn't David Bowie. And Trump, if you read his stuff, does not explain how he's going to achieve any of these things. But for now, these people are saying things that a significant section of the electorate want to hear. I don't know what's going to happen in the United States, but it looks as if he's well placed to be the Republican candidate. I don't think he'll win, but I think he's well placed to be, which in itself is an extraordinary twist, like all the other extraordinary twists, from Corbyn to Podemos to the Tsipras in Greece. It's happening everywhere in different ways. The outsiders are moving in this anti-politics era. Thank you for all your questions. If you want to find out more, I'm on down the road at King's Place, Rock and Roll Politics, April the 27th, I think, a Thursday, where we can carry on this discussion for hours. But thanks so much for listening today. Thank you very much.